When the police warn you that your words can be used against you, it's not an empty threat. Sometimes, justice can take a bizarre turn, and even a casual phrase can become the basis for serious accusations. This is exactly what happened to the heroine of our story today, whose life was shattered after one fateful incident. The Hudson River Valley, located in the American state of New York, is an ideal place for active recreation on the water. It is especially popular among kayaking and canoeing enthusiasts. They are well aware of the presence of strong currents that can pose a danger to inexperienced athletes or in extreme situations. However, this does not deter experienced enthusiasts who regularly navigate the river, enjoying its picturesque landscapes. Angelika Graswald and Vincent Viafor, who often spent time on the Hudson, decided to take another kayaking trip on April 19, 2015, closer to the evening. Both were passionate advocates of active leisure in nature, and river rafting was among their favorite activities. The couple in love, whose relationship had lasted for several years, shared similar views on life and common ambitions. They were united not only by a love for sports but also by their skill in water activities. This time, Angelika and Vincent planned to reach an island in the middle of the river, attractive for its Bannerman Castle located on the shore, built in the Scottish style. The day was wonderful, and around 7 p.m., the couple decided to head home. However, a strong wind suddenly rose on the Hudson, and the waves reached a height of about a meter, creating serious obstacles for the small kayaks. Despite the risks, the young people decided to return, as they did not have the necessary equipment to spend the night on the island. At first, they successfully battled the turbulent waves, but a few kilometers from the shore, the unpredictable happened. Vincent's kayak began to fill with water. The situation was complicated by the fact that the man was not wearing a life jacket, and the water temperature turned out to be very low. Even in the warm season, the Hudson remains cold, and in April, the river had not yet had time to warm up. With the onset of darkness, the danger increased significantly. Vincent shouted to Angelika to call the rescuers at 911, as he was already in the icy water, barely staying afloat. At 7:30 p.m. that same day, Angelika Graswald desperately called the emergency dispatcher. She reported that she was on the Hudson River with her fiancé, and he had fallen into the water without any rescue equipment. The girl explained that because of the strong wind and high waves, she could not reach Vincent to help him. The bride emphasized that her beloved was being carried further away by the current, he was drowning, and she begged them to hurry with help. When the rescuers reached the scene, the man was no longer visible. The considerable remoteness and problems with accurately determining the couple's location significantly complicated and prolonged the search. Upon arriving at the shore, the rescuers were primarily surprised that someone had dared to go kayaking in such weather. The soaked and chilled Angelika received assistance with warming up, while the search for the missing Vincent began. At first glance, the situation looked like a terrible tragic accident. The girl, sobbing on the shore, gave the impression of being sincerely saddened by the loss of her beloved, with whom she had planned a wedding in a future together. The police spoke with Angelika, trying to find out the details of the incident, but the girl, being in a state of shock, could barely speak and tried to calm down. A surprise for law enforcement officers were the alarming messages that began to come in during the search operation. Close friends of the couple claimed that Vincent was an experienced swimmer who knew perfectly well how to behave during a storm and overcome high waves. Therefore, his disappearance under such circumstances seemed strange. In addition, several witnesses drew the police's attention to the deterioration of the relationship between the lovers in the recent period. These statements forced law enforcement agencies to start a full-fledged investigation, as it was impossible to ignore such information. The circumstances of the incident raised many conflicting thoughts and questions. In particular, doubts arose as to whether the kayak could fill up with water and sink so quickly at a relatively short distance from the shore. The situation required careful study and analysis. One of the key moments that caused the most discussion was the drain plug on Vincent's kayak. First of all, attention was drawn to its size, a small hole, comparable to a coin. In addition, the location of the plug in the upper part of the vessel raised doubts about the possibility of a significant amount of water entering through it, even in an open state. To check this version, a number of additional experiments were conducted. An identical model of the kayak was used for the research, like the one belonging to the missing man, as well as a mannequin corresponding to Vincent's mass and dimensions. A series of tests was aimed at finding out how much water can get inside the kayak through an open drain hole. During the experiments, apart from the plug, all other elements of the kayak were carefully sealed. The vessel was placed in the water and exposed to artificially created waves about a meter high. The research results showed that the size of the hole is too small for the rapid flooding of the kayak. With each wave impact, only a few drops of water got inside. Such a volume did not pose a serious threat and allowed one to cover the distance of several kilometers to the shore without any obstacles. It became obvious that a small drain hole was not enough for complete filling and capsizing of the kayak. Based on these facts, the lawyer continued to insist on the version that Vincent's kayak could have overturned under the influence of a strong wave. Given the state of alcohol and such an assumption seemed more plausible than flooding through the drain plug. In parallel, Angelika denied any manipulation of her fiancé's paddle. To refute the prosecution's position, the lawyer initiated additional tests using an identical model of the paddle that Vincent constantly used. Experiments showed that the absence of a ring on the paddle does not affect its functionality. It remained convenient, rigid, and suitable for full-fledged rowing. Despite all these convincing arguments, Angelika's confession that she had removed the plug and touched the paddle remained a serious problem. This could create the impression that the girl was acting with certain intentions against her fiancé, who could have refused to marry. And receiving an insurance payout in the event of his death could become a kind of lucky ticket for her future. The defender believed that it was Angelika's words that provoked the police to defend the version of a deliberate murder committed by the bride to the last. Law enforcement officers stubbornly refused to consider the possibility of an accident, despite the obvious fact of adverse weather conditions during the incident. To solve this problem, the lawyer involved an expert on false confessions in the investigation, who had many years of experience communicating with criminals. The specialist carefully studied every minute of Angelika's 11-hour interrogation and concluded that the investigators had repeatedly violated the rules of conducting interrogations. They put obvious pressure on the young woman, which led to obtaining false testimony from her. In particular, during communication with the investigation, Angelika admitted that she had repaired Vincent's paddle and tried to process the drain plug for a tighter fit. However, there was not a single direct answer on the interrogation record that could be interpreted as an admission of guilt in murder. The frightened and exhausted girl simply fell into a trap, reacting incorrectly to several ambiguous questions. A significant part of the conversation with the police boiled down to attempts to force Angelika to repeat what they had heard from her on the island where Vincent drowned. The expert emphasized that at that moment, the girl was in a state of strong fright, was slightly drunk, and was shocked by the fact that her beloved had died before her eyes. In such circumstances, what was said cannot be considered as evidence of guilt. However, the police continued to put severe pressure on the heroine of the story, focusing precisely on her words about the events on the Hudson. The expert noticed obvious signs of manipulation during the interrogation. Law enforcement officers sought to obtain specific answers that would correspond to their version of events. Through numerous leading questions, the investigators tried to identify a possible motive for the crime, which, in their opinion, could be Angelika's anger and resentment over Vincent's non-standard preferences. The very fact that the bride touched her chosen one's kayak was regarded by the police as deliberate damage, which later led to drowning. Considering the duration of the interrogation, the expert was convinced that the testimony was actually beaten out of the girl, although not by physical influence, but with the help of tricks and persistence. The investigators even resorted to classic techniques, such as playing the good cop, bad cop game to obtain a confession. As a result, Angelika's words that at some point she thought about being free from this relationship were interpreted as an admission of guilt in murder. This contradicted the prosecution's statements, because the girl did not even use the word murder during conversations at the police station. Having received the desired answers, the police simply ignored any other statements by Angelika. And she insisted that this was far from the first voyage with a faulty plug on the kayak. As it turned out, problems with the kayak began a few months before the tragic incident, in winter. For a certain period, the plug was completely absent. Despite this, the lovers repeatedly rafted on water bodies without any adventures. Unfortunately, the investigators focused on the discrepancies in Angelika's testimony. In some cases, she claimed that the plug was in place, in others, she insisted on its absence. These contradictions became a reason for increasing pressure from law enforcement officers. The expert who viewed the interrogation recording noted a turning point when the girl began to lose self-control. She burst into tears, remembering the need to take care of her pet cat at home. After 11 hours of exhausting stay at the police station, Angelika looked tormented and drained. It seems that the detectives saw this as an opportune moment to wrest a confession to committing murder. They intensified the onslaught, bombarding the girl with suggestive questions. However, despite all efforts, Angelika never admitted her guilt. After studying the case file, the expert concluded that the confused answers during the interrogation cannot be considered reliable. Under conditions of strong emotional stress and a desperate desire to leave an unpleasant place, Angelika could unintentionally give several inaccurate answers. She did not even suspect that based on these words, a whole case of murder would be built against her, which she did not commit. The long-awaited news about the discovery of Vincent's body came on Saturday morning, May 23, 2015. A month after his disappearance on the Hudson River, a few kilometers downstream from Bannerman Island, which the couple had visited on that fateful day, a boatman noticed the man's lifeless body. The remains were taken for an autopsy. The forensic examination confirmed that the cause of death was drowning. Probably, exhausted by the cold and the struggle with high waves, Vincent could no longer stay afloat and choked on water. At the same time, no traces of violence, beating, or strangulation were found on the body. Blood analysis revealed the presence of alcohol in the body of the deceased, although its concentration was not critically high. Shortly after the discovery of the body, the search for the kayak unfolded in the same direction. Eventually, it was found, the boat was washed ashore a few hundred meters away. As it turned out, there was no drain plug on it. The paddle was found separately, with no fixing ring remaining on it. However, even in its absence, the paddle retained its functionality and suitability for use. Angelika's lawyers insisted that neither the absence of the plug nor the problems with the paddle alone could cause drowning. Only in combination with other factors, such as low water temperature, strong wind, absence of a life jacket, and the victim's state of alcohol, could these circumstances lead to a tragic outcome. The prosecutor's office, on the other hand, focused on the inconsistency of the suspect's testimony. The prosecution saw this as evidence of Angelika's involvement in the intentional murder of her fiancé. Instead, the defense continued to defend the version of an accident provoked by the victim's own recklessness. After all, Vincent deliberately went kayaking while in adverse weather conditions and increased unrest on the water, neglecting rescue equipment. The man was aware that the low water temperature practically leaves no chance of survival in case of being in it, and despite this, he took an unjustified risk. Although Angelika continued to insist on her innocence, the situation soon took an unexpected turn. The prosecutor's office reconsidered the prospects of proving the fact of intentional murder by removing the drain plug from the kayak or manipulating the paddle. Such argumentation seemed insufficiently convincing, and the chances of swaying the jury to their side were illusory. In addition, the suspect's lawyer carried out thorough work on collecting evidence and involving experts whose conclusions not only sounded convincing but were also confirmed by practical research. Under such circumstances, in order to avoid Angelika's complete acquittal, the prosecution resorted to an unexpected step. The girl was offered to conclude a plea deal for unintentional murder. According to state law, second-degree intentional murder was punishable by life imprisonment, while negligent causing of death through negligence entailed a punishment of 1 to 4 years in prison. Considering the time already spent behind bars and the prospect of spending only a few months there in case of a deal with the investigation, the lawyer advised Angelika to accept the offer. The suspect agreed. The admission of guilt made it possible to avoid a full-fledged trial before a jury. As a result, Angelika was sentenced to 4 years in prison, a significant part of which she had already served while waiting for the completion of the investigation. On December 21, 2017, having spent a total of 32 months in prison, Angelika was released on parole. However, such a court decision did not satisfy the relatives and friends of the deceased Vincent. They continued to insist on the girl's guilt and claimed that she deliberately killed her fiancé. Despite this, Angelika remained steadfast in her position. "Only God and I know the truth, and I am innocent," the girl claimed. After being released, the heroine of this story finally found peace of mind, although she faced a number of problems, including the threat of deportation and difficulties in finding employment. Angelika's attempt to receive insurance payments under Vincent's policy failed due to her admission of guilt in his death. After a short dispute and 16 months of wandering, the girl was forced to return to her homeland. There she entered university, found a job, and is trying to start life anew, recovering from the suffering and horrors she experienced. In most crimes, there is a clear motive that helps investigators determine the perpetrator's identity and the circumstances surrounding the offense. However, sometimes people's actions are so incomprehensible and devoid of logic that they remain a mystery even after a thorough investigation. It's especially chilling to realize that innocent lives are lost due to such unfathomable acts. In our time, new technologies are rapidly developing and impacting all spheres of life. This process has not bypassed forensic science. Modern methods and tools allow for more effective crime investigation and also open up the possibility of solving old cases that once shocked entire cities with their brutality. Today, we'll discuss one such case. Norma Garcia was born on November 16, 1960, in the small town of Mercedes, located in the southern part of Texas, USA, near the border with Mexico. At that time, the population of Mercedes was about 15,000 people. As in many other small settlements in the American heartland, most residents of Mercedes, about 75%, were engaged in agriculture. There was an atmosphere of cohesion and mutual support, everyone knew each other. The racial composition of the town's population was quite homogeneous. Approximately 90% were Hispanic, for whom Spanish was their first or second language. Norma Garcia's family also belonged to the Spanish-speaking community. Norma was one of 7 children in the family, having 6 brothers and sisters with whom she always maintained close and warm relationships. The girl was distinguished by her calm disposition and reticence, avoiding any trouble and always behaving more quietly than other children. When Norma turned 12, her parents decided to move to the state of California in search of a better life. They settled in Oxnard, a fairly large city with a population of 200,000. The entire family had high hopes for the move, believing that life in California would allow them to improve their financial situation. This step was especially important for the children, as it opened up new opportunities for them compared to quiet and sparsely populated Texas. Of course, life in Oxnard was very different from the measured existence in Mercedes. However, Norma quickly adapted to the new conditions and especially fell in love with the local beaches with their incredible sunsets. The girl could spend hours admiring these landscapes. In 1980, Norma graduated from high school and decided to continue her education at a local college, not wanting to part with her family for long. During her sophomore year, the girl met Anthony Rodriguez, who became her first serious love. The young couple dated for almost 2 years, and then, on March 6, 1982, they got married. Both were 21 years old at the time. This marriage was Norma's first step towards the family life she had always dreamed of. That same year, the couple had their firstborn, a son they named Andrew. And in 1989, the family was joined by another boy, Austin. Now Norma felt that she had the perfect family she had always wanted. As a loving mother, the woman strove to give her children the best of everything, especially a good education, so that they could find a worthy place in life. Therefore, in addition to raising her sons, Norma began to work actively, getting a job as an assistant manager at a local supermarket. However, despite all of Norma's efforts, the relationship with her husband began to deteriorate. In 1991, Anthony began to travel more often on business to other cities, rarely being at home. All household chores fell on Norma's shoulders. The woman had to take care of the children, household, and continue working. The relationship in the family became increasingly strained, with Norma and Anthony arguing more and more often. Norma often complained to her closest friend, Teresa, that Anthony had started abusing alcohol. The man became aggressive and could even raise his hand against his wife and older son. Despite her reluctance to become a single mother, Norma increasingly leaned towards the idea that living together with Anthony was becoming too dangerous for her and the children. After another incident, the woman decided to take a decisive step. She took her sons and moved into a duplex located a 10-minute drive from the house where they lived with Anthony. Norma filed for divorce but continued to maintain a relationship with her ex-husband for the sake of the children. Her new home was located in the neighboring town of Port Hueneme, which had a population of about 20,000, most of whom were local farm workers. Nearby was a wonderful park located not far from the coast. Norma loved walking there with her children every evening when she had free time. New neighbors considered Norma to be a friendly, albeit somewhat withdrawn person. The woman kept to herself, completely devoting herself to taking care of her children. She did not miss a single school event involving Andrew and tried to spend all her free time with her sons. Despite her devotion to her family, this period of life turned out to be quite difficult for Norma. She had to work a lot, often overtime, to provide for her children's future on her own. The woman was very tired. Her only joy and incentive to live were her sons. Norma believed that everything would be fine and could not even imagine what a tragic turn her fate would soon take. In the spring of 1993, when Norma turned 32, she met Daniel, a mechanic by profession who also coached a children's baseball team. Norma's older son, 11-year-old Andrew, also played on that team. Norma and Daniel met at a party of mutual acquaintances. There was an immediate mutual attraction between them. The new couple spent a lot of time together, often walking in the park that Norma loved so much. The man quickly found common ground with her sons. All of Norma's friends and relatives noted that the relationship with Daniel had a very positive effect on the woman. Next to him, she finally felt truly happy for the first time after a painful divorce from Anthony. But despite the apparent idyll, in the middle of the same year, Daniel suddenly told Norma that he wanted to end their relationship. For the woman, this came as a complete surprise. She took her beloved's decision very hard. Daniel explained that he had decided to rekindle his relationship with his ex-girlfriend, with whom he had recently started communicating again. The breakup with Daniel was a serious emotional shock for Norma, but the woman found the strength not to sink into depression. To distract herself from heavy thoughts and cheer up a little, she decided to arrange a barbecue party at home on Saturday, May 29, 1993. Norma invited her relatives and friends to this event, including her sisters and her best friend Beatrice. The party was a great success. The guests had a good time. And the next day, on Sunday, May 30th, Norma decided to devote herself to relaxation. She spent most of the day at home with her younger 4-year-old son Austin, mostly watching TV. The heroine's older son, Andrew, was visiting his father Anthony in Oxnard that weekend, who was supposed to bring the boy home on Monday. On the evening of May 30th, Beatrice called Norma and suggested that her friend go to the beach together the next day. Since Norma had no specific plans, she agreed. It seemed to the woman that a short walk would help to finally get rid of the sadness over the breakup with her beloved. That Sunday evening was no different from many others. Nothing foreshadowed trouble. But the very next morning, June 1st, at 7:47, the silence of Port Hueneme was broken by an alarming call to the 911 rescue service. Norma's ex-husband, 33-year-old Anthony Rodriguez, reported in an extremely agitated voice that he had found the woman dead in her own home. Law enforcement officers instantly reacted to this message, because murder cases in their small town were extremely rare. In the last 3 years, there had not been a single crime of this kind in Port Hueneme. When the investigators arrived at the scene, Anthony Rodriguez and his cousin Hector were already waiting for them near the house. Norma's 2 sons, frightened and confused, stood in the driveway. And inside the house, a terrifying sight awaited the detectives. On the living room floor lay the body of 32-year-old Norma. There were no visible bleeding or wounds on it. Instead, the victim's head was tightly wrapped in a thick layer of silver duct tape. There was so much tape that it later took experts quite a long time to cut it off to get to the face of the deceased. Now it resembled a horrible mummy mask. Upon closer examination, it became apparent that someone had tried to tear off pieces of tape in the area of Norma's mouth and nose but was forced to abandon this endeavor. The medical examiner who arrived at the crime scene quickly determined that Norma had been dead for over 24 hours. This was evidenced by clear signs of rigor mortis. Another detail that immediately attracted the experts' attention was that the victim's shorts were unbuttoned. This suggested a possible but an autopsy was necessary for a final conclusion. Examining the body of the deceased, the investigators came to a preliminary conclusion: Norma probably knew her killer well. This was indicated by one telling detail: the opaque tape that completely hid the victim's face. It was quite possible that in this way, the perpetrator was trying to avoid recognition. However, despite a scrupulous examination of the crime scene, the detectives were unable to find any direct evidence of a struggle or forced entry into the house. No blood traces or damage to the furnishings were found. The only thing that stood out from the overall picture was a bunch of house keys carelessly thrown on the floor next to Norma's body. Items of material value remained in the house untouched. It seemed that the killer did not even pay attention to them. Recalling that day, the employees of the Port Hueneme Police Department say that they mobilized all possible resources to investigate this brazen crime. The police force in the town was small, only 20 people, so forensic experts from neighboring settlements had to be involved. However, despite a thorough study of the crime scene, they were unable to find even a single clue. Later that same day, Norma's sister Aurelia came to her home. The women had agreed to go shopping together in the morning, but Aurelia could not reach Norma all day. Alarmed by the prolonged silence, the sister decided to visit Norma's house and check if everything was all right. The yellow barrier tapes that had already been thrown around the crime scene were a terrible shock for Aurelia. The victim's sister willingly shared with the police everything she knew. According to Aurelia, Norma had a strained relationship with her ex-husband, but the woman had no other ill-wishers. This information immediately attracted the close attention of the detectives. After all, it was Anthony Rodriguez who first called the rescue service and reported the death of his ex-wife. Moreover, as far as the investigation knew, he was the last person to see Norma alive, not counting her young children. The police took all the adults who were at the crime scene to the station to interrogate each of them. During a conversation with detectives, Anthony behaved like a person who sincerely mourns the loss of a loved one, although at the time of the tragedy, he and Norma had not been living together for a long time. It seemed that the man still loved her. Rodriguez assured that he had no idea who could have harmed his defenseless ex-wife. According to Anthony, on June 1st, around 7:30 in the morning, he arrived at Norma's house, as they had agreed the day before. The purpose of the visit was simple: to take the sons to school and kindergarten. This is how the ex-spouse's usual routine looked, which they continued to adhere to after the divorce for the sake of the children. This time Anthony did not come alone, but with his cousin Hector. While the father went up to the house to pick up his sons, Hector waited in the parked pickup truck. Anthony knocked on the door, but no one answered. As he later told the police, an oppressive silence reigned inside the house, no one responded to his calls. Seized by a bad premonition, Rodriguez tried to open the door, but it turned out that he did not have his own key, and Norma, for some reason, did not open it. Then the man used his bank card as an improvised lock pick, sliding it between the doorframe and the door. In this way, he managed to move the lock and get into the house. There, a terrible sight awaited Anthony. In the room on the floor, he saw the body of his ex-wife. Rushing to Norma, Rodriguez noticed that her head was wrapped in duct tape, and the top of her shorts was unbuttoned. Seeing the eerie picture, Anthony, embarrassed and frightened, rushed out of the house and called to his cousin Hector, who remained in the car. Hector hurried to the house, followed by Norma's children, awakened by the noise and shouts. The boys found themselves in the living room and saw their mother's lifeless body with their own eyes. The uncle immediately sent the shocked children to their rooms, and he himself rushed to Norma. Touching her body, Hector thought he felt warmth. He instantly grabbed scissors and a lighter from the truck and returned to the house, hoping it was not too late to save Norma. The man tried to cut the duct tape in the area of the nose and mouth so that the woman could breathe. But when he finally managed to free her face, it became clear, Norma was not breathing, there was no pulse. She was already dead. These testimonies raised some doubts among the detectives. According to the preliminary conclusions of the medical examiner, Norma's death occurred more than a day ago, and the body had already had time to stiffen. So the statement about feeling warmth seemed strange. However, Hector explained this by a state of shock and fright. Although the brothers' behavior could be considered a completely natural reaction to the horrific discovery, by their actions they unintentionally destroyed a lot of potential evidence. Their fingerprints, shoe particles, and even DNA samples got on the body in duct tape. This could seriously complicate the further collection of physical evidence. Law enforcement officers quickly found out that Anthony could have a motive for killing his ex-wife. He took their divorce hard and was extremely jealous of Norma's new relationships, especially her romance with Daniel. Apart from jealousy, the couple could have had disputes over custody of the children and the payment of alimony, since the boys remained living with their mother. Anthony admitted that although he and Norma had separated several years ago, they had not officially divorced yet. The former spouses tried to maintain a normal relationship for the sake of their sons in order to set a good example for them. From Anthony's own words, everything looked quite decent, but the victim's relatives told the detectives more alarming details. Norma's loved one said that recently the woman had been complaining about her ex-husband's excessive intrusiveness, about his constant attempts to control her every step. Anthony explained this by his natural desire to see his children more often. However, a different view was formed in Norma's family. They believed that in fact, Anthony deliberately created reasons for visits, cherishing the hope of restoring the marriage. According to their testimonies, the man had more than once suggested to Norma to go somewhere together, to spend time alone. But such proposals only irritated the woman and often became a reason for quarrels between the former spouses. In light of these circumstances, the investigators decided to check Anthony and his brother Hector more thoroughly. The men were asked to take a polygraph test, and they agreed without hesitation. To the surprise of the detectives, both successfully coped with the task. Although at first the suspicions about the brothers' involvement in the murder seemed quite reasonable, it had to be admitted that the polygraph test did not provide grounds to consider them guilty. Anthony and Hector were released, but they were not finally crossed off the list of potential suspects. The investigation continued. Now the detectives focused on other people from the victim's immediate circle of communication. After the autopsy, the forensic experts concluded that the woman had not been assaulted before her death, although her clothing was unbuttoned. It is quite possible that the killer deliberately left Norma's shorts unbuttoned in order to confuse the investigation and send it down the wrong path. The experts were most struck by the condition of the victim's head. The duct tape was wrapped around it 14 times. Almost the entire roll of tape was used to mummify Norma's face. Upon careful examination of the oral cavity, the forensic experts found cuts on the woman's tongue. Obviously, she accidentally bit it when the killer was tightening the tape. Despite the terrible mockery with the tape, it was strangulation with bare hands that became the direct cause of Norma's death. Her head was wrapped after she died. This was the conclusion reached by the medical examiner. It remained a mystery why the criminal needed to use duct tape at all, and in such a large amount. So far, the investigators did not find a logical explanation for this act. The experts managed to establish a more precise time frame for the commission of the crime. Most likely, Norma was killed between 10:30 p.m. on Sunday, May 30th, and 5 a.m. on Monday, May 31st. That is, it turned out that 4-year-old Austin was in the house with his mother's body for at least a day. The boy did not suspect anything all this time and, as usual, ran around his mother. It is quite possible that the child became the only witness who saw the killer with his own eyes. Criminologists carefully collected all the biological material that could have been left under the victim's nails during the struggle with the attacker. Traces of the criminal could also have been preserved on the duct tape. However, the level of technology development in the early 90s did not allow for a full-fledged DNA examination of these samples. All the seized physical evidence was placed in a special storage facility to preserve it for future research. Unfortunately, at that time, they could not provide any clue to solve the case. And yet, the detectives made several important conclusions about the identity of the killer. The investigators had almost no doubt that the criminal was well acquainted with Norma. And having carefully wrapped her head with tape, he most likely tried to distance himself from what he had done, to stifle the inner voice that reproached him for this eerie act. To move forward with the investigation, the police decided to question the victim's children. Norma's older son, Andrew, said that late in the evening of May 31st, his father brought him home. The boy knocked on the door, but his mother did not open it. Then Andrew noticed an ajar window. The gap was just enough to crawl inside. Once inside the house, he was surprised why his younger brother was still awake, even though it was already completely dark outside. When asked by Andrew, the boy explained that his mother was not feeling well, something was wrong with her head, so he was waiting for her to recover. The older son did not quite understand what Austin meant. Andrew assumed that his tired mother had just gone to take a nap in the living room, as she often did. So he decided not to disturb Norma, but simply put his younger brother to bed and went to his own room. Usually, children as young as Austin cannot provide too much useful information. But this time, the boy surprised the detectives with quite detailed testimony. Of course, the child was questioned in the presence of a child psychologist so as not to cause him even more trauma. According to Austin, on the evening of May 31st, his mother opened the door to a dark-skinned man named Corey. An intense argument almost immediately broke out between Norma and the stranger. And then, before the eyes of the frightened boy, Corey brutally attacked his mother and forcibly wrapped her head with duct tape. After finishing the violence, the man fled with all his might. Austin did not lose his head and ran after him in pursuit. The little boy bravely chased his mother's offender up to the street, running several dozen meters away from the house. But Corey had long legs, so the boy quickly realized that it was beyond his power to catch up with the adult criminal. Then Austin returned to the house and locked the front door behind him. Despite the fact that Austin's version sounded not entirely convincing, especially regarding the pursuit of the criminal, 10 days later the boy provided new testimony. This time he claimed that a light-skinned man named Orn entered the house through the kitchen door and wrapped his mother's head with tape. This information surprised the police, because nothing indicated that more than one person had attacked the woman. In addition, the child radically changed his previous story. Eventually, the detectives attributed these changes to excessive attention from Norma's relatives, who often communicated with Austin after the murder, which could affect his memories. Despite these discrepancies, the investigators quickly established that there were two men in the victim's immediate circle, Corey and Orn, whom Norma's relatives mentioned. It turned out that the deceased had worked with them and had friendly relations for a long time. Orrin McKee was even present at a party organized by the victim and lived about a 20-minute drive from her home. They often met and communicated, and it was known that the man had feelings for Norma. He had invited her on a date several times but was refused, after which he became even more persistent and often came to her home uninvited. The woman herself admitted that she did not have romantic feelings for him but did not want to rudely push him away so as not to offend him. Most witnesses described Orrin as a calm and pleasant person, although some considered him a bit eccentric. During interrogation, the man confirmed that he was at Norma's party. They talked until all the guests left, and then went to her house, where they watched TV for some time before he left around 10:30. The next day, according to him, he went to meet with friends in Santa Barbara. Orrin denied his involvement in the murder and insisted that his relationship with Norma was exclusively friendly, without any romantic intentions on his part. Subsequently, the suspect's friends confirmed his alibi. Another man, Corey Davis, who worked with Norma, unlike Orrin, who was her former colleague, claimed that they were just work acquaintances and communicated as friends. He reported that on the night of the murder, he was at home with his parents. During interrogation, the detectives noticed that Corey was behaving nervously and reluctantly cooperating, but apart from this, they did not find any alarming signals. Continuing communication with Norma's loved ones, the investigators unexpectedly learned from her friend Beatrice that at the barbecue before her death, the woman complained about losing the keys to the house. Interestingly, these keys were found next to the body of the deceased when the police first arrived at the call. It seemed that this information could become a breakthrough in the case. The detectives decided to talk to Corey again, who aroused their suspicions, and went to the address he provided them. However, it turned out that the man had lied and actually lived in another place. This increased the suspicion of the dark-skinned suspect. The investigators decided that both Corey and Orrin should take a polygraph test. To the surprise of the detectives, both men easily coped with the test. It seemed that the investigation had reached a dead end. There was one more interesting character on the list of suspects, Norma's ex-boyfriend named Daniel. Orrin said that shortly before the breakup, the couple had problems in their relationship, which he learned about from the victim herself. One day, Daniel even came to Norma's work and made a scene. Therefore, the police decided to interrogate him at the station. During a conversation with detectives, Daniel denied any problems in his relationship with his ex-girlfriend. He claimed that they had broken up a long time ago but remained friends. Now the man was dating another woman and claimed that he was no longer interested in Norma. He also denied the conflict at her work. Daniel's alibi was confirmed, and he managed to successfully pass the polygraph test. It seemed that the investigation had run out of leads. The only thing left for the police was to return to the very beginning of the investigation. They talked to Beatrice, the victim's friend, again. The woman admitted that her friendship with Norma was so close that she even told her about her secret affair on the side, which her husband did not know about. Norma allowed Beatrice to use her home for meetings with her lover and even gave her keys for free access. This information led the detectives to think that Beatrice's husband could have taken revenge on Norma for facilitating his wife's infidelity. Or the murder could have been the work of the friend's lover himself. Now the police had two new suspects at once, who should be thoroughly checked. First, the investigators talked to Beatrice's husband, but his alibi was confirmed. Then they met with the woman's lover, but they quickly crossed him off the list of suspects. The situation changed dramatically 26 days after Norma's murder, when the police found another body. This time, the victim was an 87-year-old deaf-mute woman named Beatrice Phyllis, who had nothing to do with the friend of the first deceased. She was found stabbed to death in her own bed in a room on the third floor of a nursing home located a few blocks from Norma's duplex. The shocking events continued a month later, on August 5, when 44-year-old Cynthia Berger, who worked as a customer service manager at one of the local companies, was found dead in her own home. Initially, firefighters were called to the scene due to a fire, but upon arrival, they found the woman's body in the bathroom. The investigation established that the victim had been strangled, but the direct cause of death was smoke inhalation, since she was still alive after the abuse. These events were a real shock for the police department of the small town, where there was practically no crime before. Now the detectives had 3 murder cases on their hands, which suggested a serial killer who needed to be stopped as soon as possible. The investigators could barely cope with such a load, even the sheriff had to do the work of a detective. At the same time, public pressure was growing, local residents organized memorial rallies, trying to draw attention to these tragedies. Given that the department was not ready to investigate such a number of serious crimes, an FBI agent who specialized in compiling psychological portraits of criminals was involved in the case. An analysis of the killer's behavior showed that he was probably very close to Norma. The agent believed that the criminal wrapped the victim's head with tape before strangulation, not after, in order to depersonalize her and suppress his own feelings that could prevent him from carrying out his plan. Almost a year and a half later, in November 1995, information appeared about a man who was suspected of murdering at least 5 women in the United States. He turned out to be 33-year-old Glenn Edward Rogers, whose modus operandi resembled the cases that occurred in the city. Glenn, known as the killer, was found guilty of first-degree murder of 2 women, the first in Florida in 1997, and the second in California in June 1999. After his arrest, he initially confessed to the police to committing about 70 murders and claimed that at the time of Norma's murder, he was in California, but later retracted these statements. Rogers is a suspect in many other similar crimes throughout the country, but there is not enough evidence to bring charges. He was sentenced to death in Florida and California, and since 1997 he has been on death row in Florida, awaiting execution. However, the results of the DNA examination excluded Glenn from the list of suspects in the Port Hueneme murder case. Interestingly, after the death of the 3rd victim, the bloody events in the city stopped. The situation changed radically only in 2000 with the emergence of innovative forensic technologies that made it possible to re-evaluate the old evidence. Law enforcement officers began to retrieve long-forgotten cases from the archives. By 2002, the analysis of the collected DNA samples did not yield any matches in the police database. But already in 2003, after repeated analyses, forensic experts managed to find a match. The DNA found under the nails of the deceased Norma belonged to 39-year-old Orrin McKee, the same former colleague of the victim who was in love with her. Now all the facts fit into a single picture, despite the fact that the man managed to deceive the polygraph. This is usually only possible for real sociopaths who feel neither emotions nor remorse. Orrin also lied about his plans for the evening after the murder and persuaded his friends to confirm a fictitious alibi. The investigators were impressed by how deftly McKee managed to deceive everyone. He seemed the least suspicious of all the persons involved in the case. But the evidence in the form of a DNA examination was indisputable. Samples of Orrin were found on the ends of the tape found on Norma's face. On August 27, 2003, the killer was arrested. During interrogation, he was given a last chance to confess, but McKee continued to insist on his version of events. Soon he refused to cooperate with the investigation altogether and demanded a lawyer. The man was taken into custody and charged with murder. Preliminary hearings in the case took place on March 2, 2004. The prosecution was still hesitating whether to qualify this crime as first or second-degree murder. But already on January 10, 2005, Orrin decided to make a deal with the prosecution and pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. However, he refused to give any explanations regarding the motives for his brutal act. According to McKee, on that fatal night he was under the influence of alcohol and so he could not remember the details of what happened. 41-year-old Orrin McKee was sentenced to life imprisonment with the right to parole after 15 years. Under the agreement, he was prohibited from filing appeals. Of course, having served the necessary minimum, he immediately began to petition for early release. But all his requests were rejected, including thanks to the active opposition from the relatives of the murdered Norma. As for the 2 other murders that shook the city, both criminals were found, and they had nothing to do with Norma's case. Orrin McKee is still behind bars. He will have the next opportunity to be released early in August 2028. The victim's family has repeatedly stated that they will make every effort to prevent his release. Considering that the killer has been denied so far, most likely the same will happen next time.
The detrimental impact of alcohol on family relationships often leads to the destruction of families and the shattering of human destinies. Under the influence of alcohol, people lose self-control and can pose a serious threat to those around them. The main character of this story, Lauren Malt, learned firsthand how dangerous a person can be when. Lauren was born on April 8, 2002, in Great Britain. The girl grew up surrounded by 3 younger brothers who provided her with reliable protection and support. The children in the Malt family were very close-knit and always ready to help one another. Lauren, as the oldest sister, often comforted her restless little brothers. However, despite the warm relationship between the children, the atmosphere in the Malt household was far from ideal. Lauren's father, unlike her kind and gentle mother, was a very cruel man. Karen, the girl's mother, grew up in a rural area in a middle-income family. While studying at college, she met Nigel Malt, an athletic and ambitious young man who dreamed of a successful career. The relationship between Karen and Nigel developed very quickly, and it seemed like they were the perfect couple to start a strong family. However, not everyone shared Karen's admiration for her chosen one. The girl's mother considered Nigel too rough and advised her daughter to end the relationship, but the love-struck Karen did not heed the advice. At first, the married life of the young couple was quite normal, and they seemed to be a happy and loving pair. They had children, but gradually Nigel's character began to change. He started manipulating his wife, morally oppressing her, and keeping her by his side through lies and emotional blackmail. By the time Lauren was born, the relationship between Karen and Nigel had already significantly deteriorated, but the woman continued to tolerate her husband. She was financially dependent on him, as frequent pregnancies prevented her from getting an education and finding a decent job. Karen hoped that she would be able to return to her studies after her maternity leave, but she soon became pregnant again. Nigel had a long history of alcohol and he started using illicit substances in his youth, and by the time of the events described, he could no longer do without them. It all began quite innocently with smoking cigarettes, but later grew into regular use of hard. Nigel's addiction had very serious and unpleasant consequences. Before his addiction reached a critical point, Nigel was a fairly adequate person. But then his behavior changed dramatically. He became very aggressive, often lost his temper, and treated his wife cruelly. Karen endured her husband's abuse for a long time, hoping that the birth of a child would make him come to his senses. She remembered Nigel as a completely different person, a pleasant, decent guy she once fell in love with. But over time, the situation became increasingly dangerous. In his fits of rage, Nigel began to get physical and beat his wife. The once calm and good-natured man now lashed out at Karen for any reason. And she had dreamed so much of a happy family, imagining her life to be like the American dream, a loving husband, a bunch of kids, a cozy home, and the opportunity to pursue her favorite activities. But all of Karen's dreams were shattered. Nigel had also once dreamed of a good career, and he and his wife complemented each other perfectly. But as soon as things started looking up, the man began abusing alcohol and it turned him into a real monster who had no control over himself. Nigel not only humiliated and beat his wife, but over time, his aggression spread to Lauren as well. Despite the horror of the situation, Karen tried her best to keep the family together, as the couple already had 4 children together. Divorce would have meant a difficult trial, division of property, and a fight for custody of the children. And although Karen and Nigel did not have much joint property, the woman was terrified of the prospect of being left alone with 4 children. Karen was most worried about the issue of alimony and the right to see the children. She did not know what her husband was capable of and was very afraid that he would use the children to take revenge on her. But there was no more strength to endure. Nigel was no longer just intimidating his family, he began to pose a real threat. If earlier the man at least earned money and provided for the family, now he had completely hit rock bottom, spending almost all the money on alcohol and Karen was most worried about the fate of the children. Lauren and her brothers grew up in constant fear, seeing their father get drunk and beat their mother every day. Although friends and relatives had long advised Karen to divorce her tyrant husband, she still endured humiliation and abuse for a long time, trying to preserve a full-fledged family for the sake of the children. Realizing that the domestic could no longer be corrected, Karen finally dared to have a serious talk with Nigel about divorce. In March 2021, she went to the police for the first time with a complaint about domestic violence. The reason was another drunken quarrel that ended in a brutal beating. However, despite the obvious traces of beatings, the police initially did not show much interest in this case. But a month later, in April, Nigel again brutally beat his wife, even more savagely than the last time. It was then that Karen realized the full horror of the situation and the real threat to herself and the children. She understood that it was necessary to act decisively and immediately put an end to this suffering. Karen called the police again and filed a report on domestic violence. Until recently, threats of law enforcement intervention had somehow restrained Nigel's aggressive behavior, but his impunity only worsened the situation and multiplied the suffering of the family. Last time, in March, Karen had succumbed to her husband's persuasion at the last moment and withdrew the statement so as not to create additional problems for him. Nigel even promised to make concessions and agree to an amicable divorce, but it later turned out that this was just a trick to buy time. After the April beating incident, Karen firmly decided not to believe any more promises and excuses from Nigel. Perhaps she would have endured the abuse further, because, as she herself admitted, she still loved this man and hoped until the last moment that their relationship could still be saved. But now Karen understood that she could no longer delay. Previously, Nigel was restrained not only by threats to call the police but also by the fear that Karen would leave him. But this deterrent effect did not last long. So, in March 2021, during an argument, Nigel threatened to kill his wife for the first time. This greatly frightened Karen. So in April, when Nigel was taken to the police station after her appeal, she took the opportunity and fled with the children from home to her mother. Meanwhile, Nigel was released on bail and placed under house arrest until the end of the trial. He again began to put pressure on Pity, saying that he would commit suicide, but Karen no longer believed a single word of his and was determined. To make her husband understand the seriousness of her intentions, she tried to get a restraining order, but unfortunately, she was unsuccessful. The situation in the family was greatly aggravated by COVID and the lockdown. During this period, serious financial difficulties arose, against the background of which Nigel began to drink even more, becoming more aggressive and cruel. His anger was now directed not only at his wife but also at Lauren and his sons, whom he treated more and more rudely. After the trial, Nigel was found guilty of domestic violence and sentenced to a suspended sentence, being prohibited from approaching his wife and children. In fact, he lost everything. His beloved wife left him, no longer wanting to listen to any promises and excuses, and the children refused to communicate with their father because of his unpredictable and cruel behavior. Nigel drank and used every day, completely losing control of his pernicious habit. He cherished vain hopes for the restoration of the relationship, but Karen was adamant and insisted on divorce. This situation finally threw the man off track. Despite his promises to quit, he seemed to be degrading even more and justifying his behavior by the desire to escape from problems. Now Karen had to take care of 4 children on her own, so the issue of alimony became acute. The woman got a job as a saleswoman in a store, but the salary was not enough, so her daughter Lauren worked part-time to somehow help her mother. However, the lawyer assured Karen that she should not worry about custody of the children. Given Nigel's alcoholism and accusations of domestic violence, the court could completely deprive him of parental rights. Lauren, who was 19 at the time, had a strained relationship with her father throughout her childhood, so she preferred to communicate with her mother. However, she still occasionally met with Nigel in order not to completely lose touch with him. Like Karen, the girl still believed that there was hope for her father's salvation. During this period, Lauren lived with her mother and brothers in her grandmother's house in the small village of West Winch, Norfolk. The girl was dating a guy named Arthur and worked a lot to help her family and save up for education. On that fateful day, Sunday, January 23, 2022, Arthur drove Lauren to work at the store where she worked as a saleswoman. During the day, Nigel called his daughter several times, but she did not want to be distracted from work by conversations with her father, who was most likely in an inadequate state. Lauren understood perfectly well that communicating with him would only spoil her mood. That day, the girl stayed at work late and was very tired. Upon returning home, she only dreamed of resting with her boyfriend, because the next morning she had to go to work again. Suddenly, late in the evening, calls from Nigel began again. Lauren had no doubt that her father had already managed to get drunk, because it seemed that he could not be caught sober even on Sunday. Lauren decided to ignore her father's persistent calls, hoping that he would eventually calm down. However, Nigel was remarkably persistent and called his daughter as many as 19 times from 6:25 p.m. to 6:52 p.m. The phone was literally ringing off the hook with incessant calls, but the girl stubbornly refused to answer. Something similar had happened before. Usually, during such conversations, her father only insulted Lauren, her mother, and brothers. These calls did not carry any useful information, but only greatly annoyed the girl and knocked her off track. Unfortunately, it was impossible to completely ignore Nigel, because he lived only a 10-minute drive from their house and could easily visit them. The worst thing was that this had already happened. Her father came uninvited and under far-fetched pretexts, arranging drunken scandals. Nothing prevented him from repeating such a visit this time as well. Around 7:14 p.m., when Nigel called again, Lauren finally answered, fearing that otherwise the situation would only get worse. Her father talked to his daughter for a few minutes. As the girl expected, the conversation had no meaningful content. Nigel immediately began to insult and intimidate Lauren. The girl tried to calm her alcoholic father down, but it seemed that this only infuriated him even more. According to Lauren's boyfriend Arthur, at 7:21 p.m., a drunk and aggressively minded Nigel drove up to their house. Karen, the girl's mother, was not at home at that time. She was at work. Lauren went outside to try to pacify her enraged father, but he only loudly insulted her and tried to start a fight. The man held a crowbar in his hands and almost hit his daughter with it several times. Nigel's behavior was extremely dangerous, but he could not even explain what exactly caused such an outburst of aggression in him. After several unsuccessful attempts to grab Lauren, her father suddenly shouted that he was going to beat her boyfriend. All this time, Arthur was next to the girl and tried to persuade Nigel to calm down. Lauren barely managed to influence her father, after which she told him to go away, because she was not going to talk to him in this state. The girl tried to put Nigel in the car so that he would finally leave. But suddenly, her father started shouting again, got into the car, and just at the moment when Lauren was standing behind the car, he abruptly backed up. The enraged man ran over his own daughter. He stopped for a few seconds and through the windshield saw that the girl was seriously injured. She was bleeding and begging for help. But Nigel did not even think to get out of the car to check on Lauren's condition or call an ambulance. Instead, he stepped on the gas and ran over his daughter a second time. It all happened so quickly that Arthur did not even have time to react and help his girlfriend. The incident attracted the attention of neighbors who called the police. One of the men ran out into the street and tried to stop the frenzied Nigel. He saw that Lauren was lying on the ground, moaning in pain and, judging by everything, had serious injuries, but was still alive. The witness understood that it was urgently necessary to call an ambulance, because the girl had probably received injuries that made it impossible to even lift her off the asphalt. But Nigel did not care. He kept repeating, as if stuck, that everything was fine with Lauren and she only had a few scratches. The father drove away both the neighbor and Arthur, who were shouting at him to stop and call for help. The men were completely shocked by what they saw. The drunken Nigel did not even think of calling an ambulance. Instead, he lifted his wounded daughter from the ground, ignoring her moans of pain, and roughly shoved the girl into the passenger seat. From the injury she received, Lauren had probably suffered fractures and could not even sit normally. She could not keep her balance. Nigel did not even bother to fasten his daughter's seatbelt, so the girl almost immediately slid to the floor in front of the passenger seat, twisting into an unnatural position. The absolutely insane man drove off in an unknown direction. During the trip, he called his ex-wife Karen and began to confusedly tell about some incident. Allegedly he accidentally injured Lauren and would bring her soon. From Nigel's drunken explanations, the woman understood little, but decided to wait until her ex-husband arrived at her work. According to the father, nothing serious had happened to his daughter. He just wanted to hand Lauren over to her mother so that Karen could take the girl to the hospital. Nigel explained that he could not do it himself because he had been drinking and was afraid of losing his license. Eventually, the man arrived at the parking lot near the store where Karen worked. As soon as the woman saw the terrible condition her daughter was in, she immediately realized that her ex-husband had greatly understated the seriousness of the situation. Lauren was barely alive. Karen tried to carefully lift the girl from the floor of the car and put her on the seat to assess the extent of her injuries. Throughout this time, Nigel just stood aside and silently watched what was happening. Lauren did not react in any way to her mother's attempts to help her. It seemed that the girl was about to lose consciousness from the excruciating pain. Realizing that every second counted, Karen immediately called an ambulance. The medics arrived at the scene and urgently took the victim to the hospital. Seeing the girl's condition, the doctors immediately realized that the injuries were extremely serious, and Lauren's life could only be saved in a well-equipped medical center. The medical staff made every effort to stabilize the patient's condition and give her a chance for salvation. However, unfortunately, the girl's heart stopped just a few minutes after she was brought to the operating room. Meanwhile, the police arrived at the scene of the incident, at the house where Lauren lived. They were met by the deceased's frightened boyfriend and a neighbor who witnessed the terrible event. The law enforcement officers immediately noticed bloody tire tracks on the driveway, silent witnesses to how the girl's own father had callously run over his daughter. Unlike many other crimes, in this case, there was enough evidence to immediately bring charges against the suspect. The forensic expert had to carefully document all the injuries the girl received as a result of the double hit and run. The autopsy showed that as a result of the incident, Lauren Malt suffered a spinal fracture, due to which she could not maintain her balance and slid to the floor of the car. The girl's chest was completely crushed, and her ribs were broken. Bone fragments pierced the lungs, causing massive internal bleeding. Injuries to the chest and abdomen proved fatal, leading to damage and destruction of many internal organs. The nature of the injuries clearly indicated that the girl had been run over by a car twice. Experts concluded that after the first hit and run, Lauren had every chance of surviving. But even after the second incident, she still had hope for salvation if she had been provided with professional medical assistance on the spot without trying to transport her on their own. The fatal mistake was the attempt to put the seriously injured girl in the car. This only worsened her condition. Precious time was lost, and this delay, unfortunately, cost Lauren her life. The suspect, 45-year-old Nigel, was immediately detained. The initial examination showed that the man was in a state of severe alcohol. The level of alcohol in his blood was more than twice the permissible norm for drivers of vehicles. Karen was sure that it was because of alcohol or drugs that her ex-husband behaved so inadequately and cruelly. Of course, the state of in no way justified what had been done, but only aggravated Nigel's guilt. Once in custody, the man refused to cooperate with the investigation. He provided only basic personal data, name and address of residence, but refused to give any comments about the incident. During the preliminary hearing of the case, Nigel still did not admit his guilt, despite the irrefutable evidence provided by witnesses. The man insisted that his daughter's death was just an accident. According to the version of the deceased's father, that evening he came to Lauren because she first did not answer his calls, and then began to talk rudely with him on the phone. Nigel allegedly wanted to pacify his daughter, but nothing came of it, so he decided to leave and postpone the conversation for later. The man claimed that when he got into the car and backed up, he felt the car run over something. He thought he had run over a box, a stone, or some other object that he had not noticed in the rearview mirror. Nigel insisted that he did not even suspect that he had hit his own daughter. Allegedly, in order to get off the obstacle, he had to return to the starting position, and then he, supposedly to his great surprise, ran over Lauren again. Of course, all these testimonies were nothing more than the cowardly lies of a criminal who, even after what he had done, did not dare to admit his guilt. The investigators drew attention to the indifference and cold-bloodedness with which Nigel spoke about his daughter's death. It seemed that this blatant display of cruelty did not bother him at all. On the contrary, when talking about his family, the man always spoke about Karen and Lauren with disdain and contempt. For everyone, such behavior of Nigel was completely incomprehensible. After all, Karen was a decent woman and a caring mother who devoted herself to her family. Lauren inherited her mother's best traits and, despite the extremely unfavorable family atmosphere caused by her tyrant father, grew up to be an honest and responsible girl. She never abused alcohol or drugs. Instead, she dreamed of getting a good education, building a career, and achieving a better life. Lauren's neighbor and boyfriend strongly refuted Nigel's claims about the unintentional nature of the hit and run. According to them, after running over his daughter while reversing, the man looked at her for a few more seconds. The car's headlights clearly illuminated the girl, so her father simply could not help but notice her. And then he turned on the transmission and deliberately ran over Lauren a second time. The witnesses insisted that everything that happened could not be attributed to an accident. Even if we assume that the first time Nigel really did not notice his daughter, then during the second hit and run, she was definitely in his field of vision. The neighbor claimed that that evening a serious conflict occurred between Lauren and Nigel. The man behaved extremely aggressively, threatening his daughter and her boyfriend with a crowbar. Even when running over Lauren, Nigel had a malicious grin on his face. He clearly was not going to stop. The incident witness, a neighbor named Gert, suggested that the reason for Nigel's sudden outburst of cruelty was that Lauren dared to ask her father to leave. However, the investigation had not only the testimony of eyewitnesses at its disposal. While Gert was trying to verbally pacify the enraged man, several local residents, peering out of the windows of their houses, filmed everything that was happening on their mobile phone cameras. These video materials were later presented to the court as irrefutable evidence of Nigel's guilt. The recordings clearly show how the father deliberately directs the car at his own daughter. Moreover, the prosecution insisted that not only the second but also the first hit and run was an intentional act and not an accident. Even the defendant's lawyer agreed that it was extremely difficult to explain the incident as an accidental coincidence of circumstances. However, the defender still tried to prove that the murder was not intentional. But these arguments sounded very unconvincing in the context of the available video evidence and testimony of witnesses. The bloody tire tread marks collected at the crime scene completely matched the tire pattern on Nigel's car, but this procedure was more of a formality. Taking into account the totality of irrefutable evidence, the court found the defendant guilty of committing this terrible crime. In September of the same year, a hearing was held at which Nigel was sentenced to life imprisonment with the right to parole no earlier than after 18 years. When deciding on the term of punishment, the court took into account Karen's testimony about the systematic domestic violence by her ex-husband. The family of the deceased girl assured that they would make every effort to prevent the premature release of the killer. In an interview with the media, Karen announced her intention to be present at every meeting of the parole board in order to personally defend her position. At the sentencing, 45-year-old Nigel appeared in a very pitiful state. According to reports, his health had significantly deteriorated during his time in pre-trial detention. The man even moved with the help of crutches and had almost completely grayed. However, even in such a state, he still did not admit his guilt, insisting that his daughter's death was a tragic accident. Some believe that the defendant was trying in this way to soften the judges and appear in the role of a victim, as he often did in relations with his wife. Others were convinced that all these misfortunes and illnesses were a just retribution that this cruel murderer fully deserved for his actions. Be that as it may, Nigel is currently serving his sentence in a correctional institution, and his health, according to available information, has more or less stabilized. Karen Malt was determined to finally sever all ties with her ex-husband. For her, it was humiliating to bear the surname of a person who, in a fit of drunken rage, had coldly taken the life of his own child. The fact that Nigel had run over his daughter twice with a car, actually using it as a weapon, left the girl no chance of survival. In view of this, Karen believed that a life sentence was too lenient a punishment for her ex-husband. The woman was convinced that Nigel should under no circumstances be released. According to Karen, we are talking about an extremely dangerous and cruel criminal who has lost all control over himself due to drunkenness and his stay at large, as the widow claimed, would inevitably lead to new tragedies. It is noteworthy that Nigel's sons have repeatedly stated that they would only be able to feel safe if their father remained behind bars for the rest of his days. The horrific story of the Malt family has shaken the public and once again heightened discussions about how to ensure effective protection for victims of domestic violence. Activists and public figures demanded harsher punishments for abusers like Nigel. In particular, there were calls to increase the length of prison terms and even to apply life imprisonment without the right to parole. Unfortunately, despite all these initiatives, no significant legislative changes have been made so far. In the world, there are many people ready to help others and sincerely wanting to contribute to improving lives. Those who have gone through difficulties and trials themselves, which others are now trying to overcome, are the most effective in such situations. However, not everyone needs or accepts help. When faced with a problematic personality and making every effort to help them, one can inadvertently cause enormous, even fatal harm, but as this story demonstrates, primarily to oneself. Tammie Apperson was an attractive woman who had worked in the modeling business for a long time. She left this field a few years before the events described. The reason for ending her career was addiction to living her entire life in the disadvantaged area of Los Angeles, Skid Row, she couldn't resist the temptations. As a result, by the age of 30, she found herself in the grip of drug addiction. Fortunately, the heroine realized her situation and didn't want to put up with it, so she decided to undergo a rehabilitation program. By 2000, when she turned 38, she managed to radically change her life. Despite a long struggle with the pernicious addiction, she took advantage of the second chance given to her. At the time of the events in question, those who couldn't pull themselves together and break the vicious circle were able to completely overcome the destructive habits. Tammie started a new life and decided to help others so that they too could have the opportunity to achieve the same and steer their existence in a normal direction. She lived in the Burlington Plaza apartment complex, created with state support. It was built as a shelter for people who wanted to get another chance. Here, those who had just begun the fight against bad habits, as well as those who had already managed to overcome them, found refuge. For many, the complex became a real fortress that separated them from the thriving crime outside its walls. The territory was fenced and under round-the-clock security, and each visitor had to leave their signature in a special log book upon entry and exit. Unfortunately, all these security measures were not enough for the heroine of the story. She lived in a small studio on the first floor, but some criminal attacked her right inside the building. It was a brutal crime, a striking example of excessive violence, shocking even for Skid Row. When police detectives arrived at the building around 9 p.m. on November 13, 2000, they saw walls and floors covered in blood. The perpetrator showed such cruelty that blood was literally everywhere, even on the ceiling. For many police officers, this case became the most vivid manifestation of human cruelty, which was etched in their memory for the rest of their lives. At the crime scene, investigators found real ruins. In the small 10 by 12 meter apartment, everything that could be broken was destroyed. Furniture, glass and ceramic objects, household appliances, everything was smashed to pieces and scattered on the floor. All these things were also covered in blood. Tammie's personal belongings were strewn across the bed, as if the perpetrator was looking for something specific. Police officers suggested that he might have committed the attack in search of money or. The victim of the massacre herself was lying on the floor in a pool of blood. She was partially naked, her underwear pulled down, and her face horribly mutilated. There were cuts and tears on the inner thighs and in the groin area. Investigators speculated that she could have been a victim, given the position of the body, the injuries, and the partially removed clothing. From the first seconds at the crime scene, the officers were gripped by horror. Some of the forensic experts working in the building couldn't withstand the gruesome scene. Blood was everywhere, and the condition of the body was terrible. Due to the small area of the room and the incredible cruelty of the attacker, blood droplets covered absolutely all surfaces. According to police testimony, the criminal attacked the 38-year-old woman and slammed her against the wall several times. She immediately suffered serious injuries that caused disorientation or even loss of consciousness. Unfortunately, the criminal thought it wasn't enough. He beat her for a long time when Tammie was already lying on the floor. Moreover, the perpetrator used everything that came to hand. It was obvious that such a brutal massacre took a long time. First, the unknown person dealt with the apartment's resident in the cruelest way, and then methodically searched everything, scattering and smashing everything around. It was clear that this must have created a lot of noise, but none of the neighbors reported it to the police during the attack. In the opinion of the detectives, the degree of decomposition of the body indicated that the victim had died at least a day before the police arrived. Despite this, all the neighbors claimed they hadn't heard anything. This was an obvious lie, since the apartments didn't have proper soundproofing, and the scale of destruction was such that it was simply impossible to do it without noise. In fact, it was the victim's close friend who contacted the police. He himself didn't know what could have happened to her, but he couldn't reach the woman for several hours, so he suspected something was wrong. Eventually, he learned from third parties that Tammie was probably dead. When he contacted the police, it turned out that law enforcement had no information about this incident. But the man's words interested the dispatchers, and they decided to send patrol officers to check if everything was all right in the missing woman's apartment. Even a superficial examination of the body demonstrated an extremely high level of cruelty shown by the attacker. He clearly had serious reasons for such aggression or long-standing rage, because he dealt with Tammie with inhuman cruelty. Her once attractive face was disfigured beyond recognition. One of the woman's eyes turned out to be gouged out. The throat was repeatedly cut with glass shards. The victim received at least 3 blows to the face. The probable weapon for inflicting these injuries was a large screwdriver. The police found it right there, under the victim's shoulder. The holes were deep and round, so the forensic experts concluded that this object was used to commit the crime. One of the detectives immediately suggested that the motive for the attack could be the woman's beauty. Tammie was indeed very attractive. It seemed that someone wanted to destroy her beauty. Unfortunately, the criminal succeeded in this. All the blows were concentrated on the victim's face and neck. These were deep stab wounds, cuts that deprived her of any chance of surviving the brutal attack. A special expert, a specialist in the analysis of blood spatter, was called to the scene of the terrible tragedy. In this situation, he could analyze the eerie scene in the apartment and recreate the events as accurately as possible. It took him 7 hours of work just in the victim's apartment to collect all the data and form a complete picture of the crime scene. After that, several more hours of continuous analysis were needed to record, process and systematize all the data. A large number of blood stains were found in the bathroom. The body, however, was in the living room. She was probably attacked at the very moment when she was in the bathroom. Several bloody traces were found that could have been left if the woman's bloodied back of the head was pressed against the wall. Several similar stains were found at different heights. It seemed that Tammie was being strangled by someone strong, trying to lift her off the floor. In addition, at the time of the attack, the bathroom door was closed, as evidenced by the blood drops on their inner side. A trail of blood drops led from the bathroom to the living room. It appeared that the perpetrator carried the victim's body to the living room in his arms so that her legs were hanging down. After that, Tammie was laid on the floor and the torture continued. Obviously, it was at this moment that she received those deep blows with a screwdriver, as well as cuts on the throat, which ultimately led to her death. The forensic experts had an incredible amount of work to do, as the attacker used several murder weapons at once. He beat his victim not only with a screwdriver, inflicting blows to the face, but also cut her throat with glass fragments from the coffee table. Several pieces of furniture, in particular a wooden chair leg, looked suspicious. All this was generously covered in blood, thrown at the crime scene, and therefore could contain valuable evidence and DNA materials that would help identify the brutal killer. All materials were collected and sent to the laboratory for detailed analysis. It was assumed that the criminal could not have avoided injuring himself during such an execution, so the forensic experts hoped to find his blood as well. Among the household items used by the attacker was a poof, an interior element that they couldn't even identify at the initial stages of the investigation. It was literally smashed to small splinters, but all covered in blood. A similar condition had an unrecognized glass product, which the detectives initially mistook for a lighting lamp, but in the laboratory it was found out that it was actually a massive, thick-walled flower vase. The decorative object was broken into several parts, each of which had a large number of blood stains. The fragments of these objects looked as if they were used to cut the victim's throat and beat her. Forensic experts assumed that the criminal was breaking all these things on his victim while she was lying unconscious in the center of the room. This beast took item after item and beat Tammie until the thing was completely destroyed, after which he took the next one and continued the execution. The most striking thing was that the inevitable loud noise was completely ignored by the residents of the complex. The forensic experts managed to establish that the criminal consistently smashed a candlestick in the bathroom, then a poof, a vase, and finally used a lamp, on which the most traces of blood were found. During a thorough inspection of the victim's small apartment, police officers found several important pieces of evidence. A blood-soaked rag was lying in the bathroom sink. It probably contained traces of the attacker's blood. It later turned out that it had Tammie's DNA on it, which meant that the killer was trying to cover up traces of the crime by wiping away the blood. But he obviously abandoned this idea when he realized the scale of what he had done and understood that it could take days. Clearly, he just left everything and ran away. There was also a bottle of water with a red fingerprint on the surface. A large number of paper towels with similar traces were found in the trash can. In addition to the brutal massacre, Tammie was as her underwear and clothes remained pulled down. These suspicions were confirmed by the medical examiner. At the same time, traces of blood were found on the parts of the victim's body, indicating that contact with the attacker occurred after the beating. Forensic experts took a swab from the wall to obtain the DNA of the probable killer. Given the nature of the attack, police officers immediately began searching for enemies among the victim's closest circle. In her apartment, they found several items that she clearly considered valuable and put in a frame. However, there were no family members, friends, or men here. These were photographs from her modeling activities, a certificate of education, as well as confirmation of completing an addiction treatment program. Obviously, the victim was very proud of all these things. It was a neat apartment, clean and tidy, which the woman kept in order, decorating it with angels and flowers. It didn't resemble the typical dwelling of a person suffering from addiction or close to the criminal world. By all indications, including the words of the woman's acquaintances, Tammie had indeed overcome her bad habits and was leading a normal life. However, there were still many suspicious individuals in her circle, especially those who had problems with addiction. A few years before these events, Tammie herself was in a brutal criminal environment. The heroine of the story managed not only to overcome the craving for prohibited substances, but also found a fairly decent job. The woman got a job as an office manager at a Hollywood telephone service that served celebrities. In addition, she got involved in volunteer work. The church, located near the complex, offered her to counsel people who had problems with addiction. She agreed, as she saw in this activity an opportunity to help those in need. Given that the attacker wanted to destroy her beauty, as well as the fact that it was a very attractive woman, police officers suggested that the perpetrator could be a rejected lover or a secret admirer who never received a response from Tammie. Almost immediately, the detectives got a lead on the likely perpetrator. One of the residents of the complex, who wished to remain anonymous, told about the possible killer. The first suspect was named Ronald Sims, whom everyone called Ron. The man also had a long history of addiction to hard which he continued to struggle with. In addition, he had dated Tammie for some time. Their relationship ended when the woman was able to overcome her craving, and he never found the strength to break the vicious circle. However, they continued to communicate regularly and maintained a friendly relationship. The woman was sure that he needed her help, so she actually counseled him and helped him by her own example. The police immediately contacted Ron, as he turned out to be a possible candidate for the role of the killer. However, he refused to admit guilt. He said that he maintained purely friendly relations, they didn't quarrel, and he would never be able to hurt her. The man shared a more sinister story. According to him, he maintained a relationship with Tammie not only in the hope of ending his problems, but also to provide her with protection. The fact is that during the counseling sessions that she conducted in the church, the heroine of the story met a suspicious man. He became a real stalker, so Ron backed her up. This man's name was Troy Powell. At the time of Tammie's death, he was 32 years old, but the suspect was on probation after another imprisonment. It turned out that the three of them were friends, communicated in the same company, attended church together, but it always felt like Troy was in love with Tammie. From the first acquaintance, he began to meet the mentor after work, give her flowers and teddy bears. He waited for her in his pickup truck almost every day and offered to give her a ride. During this period, a bus driver's strike was going on in the city, so Tammie sometimes agreed to this offer, although she usually rode with others. Troy suffered from addiction, the deceased considered him potentially dangerous, so she rarely rode with him. She didn't confess to her ex-boyfriend Ron that she used Troy's help only in exceptional cases. It was still less risky than walking the streets of one of the most dangerous areas of the city. The man misinterpreted her consent to give her a ride. Troy was convinced that he had a chance. In fact, Tammie was not only forced to use his help, but also wanted to help the man cope with his problems. She gave him advice, supported him, but kept her distance and didn't want any romantic relationship. The woman repeatedly directly stated this to her admirer, but he became more and more persistent. Recently, his obsession with Tammie began to manifest itself more and more vividly, and the woman tried not to cross paths with him. Tammie's loved ones believed that he was involved in the woman's murder. Troy was quick-tempered and aggressive, as well as obsessed with her. A chilling find was discovered in the victim's apartment, a telephone address book. In it, the deceased kept a record of all the calls of this suspicious person. There were many notes here indicating what time Troy called, how long the conversation lasted. Tammie also noted how it ended, whether there were threats or something similar. Mostly she ended such conversations with a request not to bother her with calls anymore. However, he contacted her again the same day. This went on for quite a long time. Soon, one of the suspect's acquaintances told Ron that Troy had confessed to him about the murder. After that, Ron called the police and reported it. According to the witness, Troy told him that he came to visit Tammie, they had a nice chat, had and then quarreled, and in a fit of anger, he killed the woman. Despite the eloquent story, the police officers were not sure that he was telling the whole truth. He was detained and taken to the police station until the circumstances were clarified. He was also still on the list of suspects, as he was a criminal. Ron had a conviction for theft, even a motive for reprisal, which could be jealousy of an ex-girlfriend. But later the man was released. Meanwhile, they couldn't find Troy. He got lost in a city with a population of 4 million people and could have fled, as he got a head start of several hours. The records of the log book of the complex where the deceased lived were checked. It turned out that Troy did indeed go inside on the day of the murder, and left only a few hours later. When the probable killer was leaving, he was asked about Tammie, because leaving without the accompaniment of residents was prohibited. Then the criminal answered with a smile that the woman was resting. They believed him and let him go. He was the last one who visited the apartment of the deceased, which further increased the suspicions about him. On the same day, according to Ron, he had planned work with Tammie in the church. He called her, but Tammie never answered. And this seemed strange, because she was always willing to talk on the phone. The church reported that the woman did not come. The next morning, Ron went to her work, but Tammie wasn't there either. The man couldn't get into the territory of the residential complex, as at this time he broke down again and started using the substance. They simply didn't let him into his friend's apartment, but he saw that Troy's red pickup truck was parked on the street near the house, which caused him concern. He kept calling her persistently, but Tammie never picked up the phone, so he contacted the police. The detectives were reconstructing the picture of the fatal day and came to the conclusion that on the eve of the murder, after the church, Tammie was picked up by her stalker. They went to the store and bought a Bible, which the woman gave to Troy. She believed that he was on the path to correction. Obviously, the man was able to arrange under some pretext for her to let him come visit. According to Tammie's close friends, she wasn't going to give Troy a chance, but she was always a little naive, so he could simply convince her that he wanted help, advice in connection with his addiction. The woman put her heart and soul into this activity, sincerely believing that she was making the world a little better, and probably couldn't refuse. That's how he got into the house. Unfortunately, she trusted her environment too much, which was far from ideal. When the detectives checked Troy Powell's criminal past, it turned out that he had a long history of offenses, including serious crimes. These included the use and distribution of burglary, and he served a sentence for attacking another woman he was also stalking. That woman miraculously survived his attack. The man was clearly a danger to society, especially to females. At the same time, he had a very masculine appearance, was muscular and tall, a cool guy, which attracted the attention of girls. The police sent out an alert to find this person's vehicle, a red pickup truck. It was described in detail by Ron, as he had repeatedly seen the car in which the probable killer met Tammie. The very next day after the detectives arrived at the scene of the massacre, the investigators got a lead. It turned out that Troy was seen at a friend's house in San Pedro, about 30 kilometers from the complex. Obviously, he was hiding from another person who also turned out to be on parole. Police officers were sent to this address. They managed to find out that Troy had left his pickup truck and left about 45 minutes ago. Given the fact that the suspect was not using his car, he could simply get lost in the crowd of the city. However, the very next morning, luck smiled upon the police officers. The pickup truck was taken at night. Fortunately, one of the patrol officers, who regularly checked the hotel for parolees, found an unfamiliar car in the parking lot that same morning, which turned out to be a noticeable red pickup truck. The officer checked the license plate and found out that the vehicle belonged to the wanted trio. The detectives were informed and arrived at the scene, intending to detain the main suspect. The police waited outside the building until the killer picked up his car. The driver was detained. He was a stocky tall man. The most suspicious fact was his baseball cap, on which the investigators found drops of blood. However, the detainee insisted that his name was Charles Vanoy. After checking the documents, they were able to make sure that he was telling the truth. In any case, it was decided to detain the man and analyze the red stain on his headgear. He told the story that his friend Troy had given him the car the day before and picked it up at night along with a jacket, a camera, and other things. In fact, the two were former cellmates, so they kept in touch even after being released from prison. The police immediately searched the hotel room. Here, inside the camera, they managed to find a film, and after developing it, several images appeared showing Tammie, Charles, and Troy. According to Charles, they all met in church, where Tammie helped people rehabilitate after problems with. Unfortunately, the DNA tests took much longer, but in the end, it was established that the blood on the baseball cap did not belong to the victim of the massacre. It was decided to interrogate Charles, and after some time he admitted that he possessed valuable information but was ready to share it in exchange for protection from persecution. The police agreed, and according to the criminal, Troy confessed to the massacre of his secret love, from whom he could never get reciprocity. He gave him the pickup truck and was going to hide from the police. At the same time, his cellmate claimed that the killer did not rule out the possibility of voluntarily surrendering to the police. Charles Vanoy insisted that he had nothing to do with the massacre, but during the interrogation, he provided information that only the perpetrator or a witness could clearly know. The man was aware that Tammie's throat was cut and she was hit several times in the face with a screwdriver. However, it remained unclear whether his former cellmate had told him these details or whether he himself was present at the scene of the massacre. Thus, Charles was forced to cooperate with the investigation, so he informed the detectives that Troy was supposed to call him at 7 p.m. that same day. The man agreed to help the police officers to catch the killer. The friends contacted each other by phone. At that moment, the police managed to establish the address where the criminal was located. He was detained while watching an adult movie in a hotel. Right there, Tammie's keys to her office were found. As it turned out, he was planning to rob it. His DNA was found on the body of the deceased after the. His numerous bloody fingerprints were found on many objects. And the victim's blood was on his clothes. Therefore, there was no doubt left that it was Troy who was behind the crime. According to Troy, he did indeed kill Tammie. However, he was in an insane state. The criminal said that he suffered from mental disorders. And during this period, he had not been taking prescribed medications for a long time, as he had no money to buy them. According to his claims, he came to visit his beloved woman. Here they had relations by mutual consent, because they were dating. However, later another man called her, and this made him very angry. Tammie refused to discuss this call with Troy and just went to the bathroom. He followed her, closed the door, and dealt several blows with his fist to her head. According to the suspect, he remembered nothing after that. By this time, some of the analyses of the collected evidence had been completed. It turned out that all the fingerprints belonged to the detainee. At this stage, the forensic experts suspected that this attack was something more than just beating. It was assumed that he tortured his victim. The killer was charged with premeditated murder associated with breaking and entering, and torture. Collectively, all this gave good reason for the prosecution to demand the death penalty. However, Troy was not going to give up without a fight. He claimed that he had been struggling with a mental disorder all his life, because of which he could not stand trial. In the end, the hearing had to be postponed due to a psychiatric examination. According to its results, it was proven that the criminal did not lose the ability to be aware of his actions during the attack. He described the sequence of events in sufficient detail to his friend Charles, who became one of the key prosecution witnesses. Troy himself cited childhood trauma as the reason for the attack. According to the defendant, he suffered from the cruelty of his alcoholic father throughout his childhood. All this resulted in deviations, because of which he could not stand a woman's rejection and instantly fell into a rage, losing control of himself. All this was confirmed by psychiatrists. One of the key stages of the hearing was Troy's testimony for the defense. Usually, such episodes do more harm to the accused, but he was well versed in the judicial system, so his words sounded quite consistent. He admitted that he could be the killer but claimed that he didn't remember anything. At the same time, the defendant believed that the woman was still alive when he left the apartment, so, in his opinion, the murder was unintentional. Troy also denied any problems with the opposite which his psychiatrist talked about. His mother and two sisters spoke on the side of the accused. In fact, they all had stories about how Troy's attacks led to serious injuries. He even broke his own mother's spine, pushed his sister down the stairs a few years before these events. And then he insisted that he had a memory lapse. However, relatives continued to claim that he was a good person and was not capable of a brutal massacre. The testimony of forensic experts indicated the opposite. One of the prosecutor's most terrifying claims was that he tortured his victim for a long time before her death. Forensic experts found torn wounds in Tammie's groin. According to the experts, these were the most horrific mutilations they had seen in their entire careers. They spoke of the victim being brutally beaten, not of relations by mutual consent. The jury decided that Troy Powell was guilty on all charges, and he was sentenced to death. He is currently awaiting execution in the death row cell at San Quentin Prison.
Sometimes people seem to sense their impending demise, as if the cold breath of fate is penetrating their souls. Undoubtedly, this prompts them to take any precautionary measures to avoid danger. However, as life experience shows, even the most meticulous preparations are not always capable of averting the inevitable, because, as they say, you can't escape your destiny. The main character of our story today is Terry McAdams, a lively and charming 22-year-old girl originally from Arkansas. During the period in question, she resided in the city of Arlington, Texas. From a young age, Terry stood out among her peers for her beauty and irrepressible energy. As a teenager, she often drove around the neighborhood in her own convertible. Locals frequently spotted Terry listening to music loudly while cruising the city streets with her friends. There were even rumors that the girl could usually be heard before she appeared in sight. Terry had two sisters with whom she enjoyed spending her free time. She gladly performed in the cheerleading squad, dressed brightly, had many admirers, and led an active life. Despite the fact that the girl invariably found herself in the spotlight, she never took advantage of it, remaining modest and well-mannered. Terry was passionate about dancing and devoted many years to lessons, training, and various events. The most vivid memory of her life was meeting Princess Diana. This event occurred when the girl was traveling through Europe after graduating from high school. During a trip to Great Britain, at one of the dance parties, Terry accidentally crossed paths with the famous princess. That incident was forever etched in her memory. For her younger sisters, Hopper and Pamela, Terry was an older friend and confidant. The girl had warm relationships with all family members, but she shared a special bond with her sisters. Terry became a mentor to them, a kind of bridge between the mother and the younger generation. She often gave her sisters dance lessons and taught them how to drive a car. Everyone who was lucky enough to know Terry noted her sincere love for life. Immediately after finishing school, the girl enrolled at the University of Arkansas. Even before receiving her diploma, she decided to move in with her fiancé, who lived in Arlington, Texas. He was a few years older than Terry and had already completed his education. Since Terry intended to continue her studies, she transferred to an institution located closer to her beloved, the University of Texas at Arlington. There, the girl joined a women's society, and everything in her life seemed to be going as well as possible. Terry planned to get a job after graduation, build a career, and also marry her boyfriend, who had already proposed to her. However, starting from 1984, the front pages of local newspapers increasingly featured horrific news about the murders of young women in Fort Worth and the surrounding areas. Although Terry was still studying at the university at that time, she took the news of the threat very hard. The girl was seriously worried about her own life and repeatedly shared her fears with her fiancé and family. Terry made every effort to protect herself from potential danger. In particular, she quit her job at a car rental agency, where she had to travel daily and return home after dark. Despite the fact that it was a promising and high-paying position, Terry understood that night trips could prove fatal. Although the girl was known for her inexhaustible energy and youthful enthusiasm, she began to lead a reclusive lifestyle. Under no circumstances did Terry leave the house during the dark hours, attend parties, or have any contact with strangers. Even during the day, Terry tried not to leave the house without the escort of her fiancé. The girl was afraid to even go to the store for groceries and called her mother in Little Rock several times a day to share her experiences. She was truly oppressed by the uncertainty of the situation and the fact that law enforcement officers could not establish the identity of the criminal and put an end to the brutal murders. It was then that the investigative authorities of Texas formed a special task force, which included the most experienced specialists. Their task was to investigate the crimes committed and stop the series of bloody reprisals. It was assumed that a serial killer, or perhaps even more than one, was operating in the county. Terry seemed to be tailor-made for the role of the ideal victim, an attractive girl of the right age who lived in a dangerous area. It was extremely difficult for her to cope with the panic thoughts, but her fiancé supported his beloved in every possible way. As Terry confessed to her mother and sisters, the most terrifying thing for her was to be alone. So her boyfriend had to quit his previous job and find a new, high-paying one, although it involved frequent business trips to neighboring cities. On the days when her fiancé was away, Terry was gripped by panic and hardly left the apartment. After classes at the university, the girl immediately hurried home. And if there was an urgent need to settle pressing matters, Terry tried to do it in the morning, at the first opportunity, and always looked for someone who could keep her company. Fortunately, her beloved's business trips usually lasted no more than 1 or 2 days, so the girl could handle the situation. The morning of February 13, 1985, was remembered by the local police department for an alarming call. An employee responsible for the technical maintenance of apartments in the residential complex where the main character of our story lived reported the inability to enter one of the homes. Usually, such situations arise for completely innocent reasons and do not cause particular concern. However, this time it was about Terry's apartment, with which the man was well acquainted. The repairman noticed a strange circumstance. The day before, they had agreed on a morning visit to carry out repair work. Terry simply could not ignore this meeting. Moreover, he knew about her hypertrophied fears. Previously, the master did not attach much importance to this, but now he wondered, what if the girl's fears had real grounds? The police officers who arrived at the call also did not wait for the door to be opened. Attempts to contact the girl's relatives proved futile, so it was decided to question the residents of the building. The neighbors confirmed the repairman's words. They also could not get through to Terry, but instead heard suspicious noises from her apartment. After that, the alarmed people tried to find out what had happened, but no one answered the calls. Given the testimony of the neighbors and their concern, law enforcement officers were forced to resort to radical measures and break down the door. But the picture that opened before them turned out to be incredibly eerie. On the bed in the bedroom lay the mutilated body of the girl. It seemed that the unfortunate victim had been tortured for a long time and cruelly. Terry was the victim of a brutal and she was also savagely beaten with a blunt object. From the condition of the body and traces of blood, experts concluded that the crime occurred at night or early in the morning, shortly before the police were called. The criminologists who arrived at the scene immediately set about collecting evidence. Everything indicated that a fierce struggle had taken place here. Terry's desperate resistance was eloquently testified to by numerous defensive injuries on her arms and upper body. But the girl's face suffered the most. It was disfigured by long beatings, with fists and some hard object that shattered bones. There were traces of strangulation on the neck, but it seems that the attacker, for some reason, abandoned this method of murder. The forensic experts suggested that death occurred as a result of a craniocerebral injury. In addition, Terry was subjected to a particularly brutal rape, but it was not possible to establish whether it happened before or after the murder. A lot of DNA traces were found on the victim's underwear and bed sheets. However, at that time there was no way to establish to whom they belonged. At that period, DNA analysis methods were just emerging and could not be used in the investigation. There were also no video surveillance cameras or geolocation tracking yet. All this greatly complicated the disclosure of the crime. The version about the robbery was quickly discarded, because many valuables remained in the apartment, including those that were in plain sight. Even if the criminal took something with him, given the brutality of the massacre, it was unlikely that the purpose of the attack was to seize property. Therefore, attention was focused on the search for suspects among the closest circle of the deceased, those who could have personal motives, hold a grudge, hatred, or desire for revenge. However, it turned out that the girl had no enemies. Terry McAdams was described as an extremely pleasant, benevolent, and non-confrontational person. None of her relatives could even imagine who would wish death to this student. During the searches of the crime scene, which took place in mid-February, law enforcement officers could not find the murder weapon. Forensic experts suggested that it could have been a hammer or a similar metal tool. A cigarette butt was found in the apartment, although none of the residents were smokers. Most likely, it belonged to the killer. Unfortunately, the technological capabilities of that time did not allow obtaining a DNA sample. There were too few traces of saliva to obtain a significant amount of valuable information. The only thing the detectives were able to find out was the brand of cigarettes that the criminal smoked. Undoubtedly, one of the priority versions of the investigation was the involvement in the murder of a serial who had already committed similar crimes in this area. The police compared the details of the crime and the method of murder with other incidents that occurred nearby. There was a certain connection between them, because the handwriting matched, although not completely. Based on the data collected during the investigations of other cases, the detectives assumed that, most likely, the criminal was not familiar with his victims. The attacks occurred spontaneously. The killer tried not to leave traces and not attract the attention of neighbors, so he penetrated the apartments through the balcony doors, and not the main entrance. A clear imprint of the criminal was found on the outer window frame. It seems that he climbed a tree that grew a few meters from the wall of the apartment building. Unfortunately, apart from these few facts, the investigators were unable to obtain more valuable information. It was necessary to conduct a more thorough analysis, in particular, a forensic medical examination of the body. Investigators spoke with the relatives of the deceased, paying special attention to the girl's mother and sisters, with whom she had the closest ties. They were all shocked by what had happened. As far as those close to her knew, Terry could not have such fierce enemies who would dare to take her life. It also seemed strange that the girl seemed to anticipate her own death. She was wary of leaving home, afraid of becoming a victim of an attack, but despite this, she was killed in her own apartment. News of the incident spread like lightning through the city, and the local community began to say that a man who could penetrate any dwelling was definitely operating in their area. People assumed that he was hunting for pretty girls, tracking them down, lying in wait for them, and attacking. Residents finally became convinced that no one could feel safe, and young women risked becoming the next victims of bloody reprisals. And, like most people in such situations, they decided to take protection into their own hands. Over the next few months, the sale of weapons and ammunition in local stores increased significantly. Many people were arming themselves, and the public was putting more and more pressure on the police, demanding results. The county sheriff appeared on local television, urging everyone who had even the slightest information about the crime to report it to law enforcement. As soon as Terry's murder was reported in the local news, calls from citizens began to come to the police department. However, this did little to help the investigation progress in solving the case. At a certain stage, one of the main suspects was Terry's fiancée. But from the very beginning, this version looked unpromising. Investigators tried to fit the young man into the picture of the crime, trying on the psychological portrait of the killer in order to close the case faster and calm the public. But it turned out to be impossible. No one from the girl's inner circle could believe that her beloved was capable of such a beast. As soon as the alibi about the fiancé's business trip was confirmed, they left him alone. The young man was indeed outside the city, and the murdered girl was just about to meet him at the airport at the moment when the police found her body. Detectives questioned the girl's relatives to reconstruct the chronology of events on that tragic day. On the morning of February 13, Terry went to study. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, she left the university, got into her car, and headed home. At home, the girl changed clothes and went shopping, again in her own car. Terry was alone, although she usually tried to take her friends with her, but this time they were all busy. Terry's primary destination was the nearest grocery store. The girl needed to buy ingredients because she was planning to bake a festive cake for her fiancé for the upcoming Valentine's Day. He was just about to return from another business trip the next morning. The young man arrived home just a few hours later when forensic experts were already actively working at the crime scene. The supermarket cashiers confirmed that they saw the girl at the checkout and provided a receipt that certified her purchases. The ingredients for the cake were indeed among the purchased goods. It was established that Terry left the store at about 6:30 in the evening. Investigators questioned everyone who could have crossed paths with the girl at that moment, hoping that someone had noticed something suspicious, such as a stalker following her or something similar. But no one noticed anything alarming. According to eyewitnesses, it was an ordinary shopping trip. Terry behaved calmly, paid at the checkout, and drove away. It seemed that no one was following the girl. After returning home, she did not leave the apartment again. In the morning, Terry had an appointment with an electrician because she had problems with the wiring. It was thanks to this man that the body of the deceased was discovered. A tragic coincidence of circumstances. None of the neighbors living behind the wall were at home either in the evening or at night. Those who heard some kind of suspicious fuss lived further down the corridor, so they could not fully assess the scale of what was happening. Moreover, the noise subsided relatively quickly, so people calmed down. The brutality with which the crime was committed indicated an extraordinary hatred of the criminal for his victim. In such cases, the killer is usually sought among the immediate circle of the deceased. However, in Terry's case, this hypothesis did not work, because her fiancé was far outside the city. The man was shocked by the news of the tragedy because, in recent months, he and the girl had been planning a wedding. He even managed to give her an engagement ring worth $5,000. Interestingly, during the searches, the police never found the jewelry. At first, this led to the idea that the motive for the attack could have been a robbery that went wrong. However, this version turned out to be far-fetched. After a more thorough analysis of the events, it became obvious that nothing else was missing except for the ring. Apparently, the criminal simply grabbed it in passing, probably because it was in plain sight. There was no doubt that the offender would definitely try to sell the precious jewelry. Therefore, law enforcement officers distributed about 250 leaflets with an image of the ring to all pawnshops in the nearest cities, Fort Worth and Dallas. In addition, all retail outlets and organizations that had at least some relation to the circulation of valuables were notified. But despite this, no one contacted the police with information about the stolen engagement ring. Although the investigators checked all possible leads, none of them led to convincing results. Each of the suspects, about whom certain questions arose, was able to provide an alibi. Their testimonies were confirmed by witness statements or documents. Law enforcement officers also became interested in individuals who had convictions for violent crimes and lived nearby. They even managed to find several potential candidates for the role of the killer who were at large at the time of the crime, but each of them was able to prove their innocence. Gradually, the investigation began to reach a dead end. Terry's relatives made desperate efforts to move the case from a dead point. They repeatedly appealed to the public, including through the media. They appeared on television and radio. In addition, countless posters with a call for help were printed and pasted. But, unfortunately, none of these attempts were successful. In the end, the case of the murder and Terry McAdams had to be sent to the archive of unsolved crimes. The girl's family did not stop trying to achieve justice, but the police simply lacked the necessary materials and capabilities to move forward. The investigation stalled for a long 36 years, until 2021. It was then that a group of specialists was finally formed, which included experienced detectives and forensic experts. Their task was to take a fresh look at long-forgotten cases and crimes, armed with the most modern technologies. Among these cases was the murder of Terry McAdams. Law enforcement officers were provided with innovative DNA research methods that allowed them to look at old evidence from a different angle. The criminal's biological material remained on the victim's underwear and sheets. The girl desperately resisted, so particles of the attacker's skin were found under her nails. The cigarette butt, which was stored in the archives, was also sent for examination. After all, the killer's saliva could have remained on it. A comprehensive analysis made it possible to compile a profile of the likely criminal. However, when the data obtained was compared with the Cody's database, which contained information about registered offenders, no matches were found. Terry's relatives hoped that they would finally get answers to the questions that had been haunting them for long decades. But, despite all the enthusiasm, the investigation stalled again, for at least a few more years. Fortunately, work on the case never stopped for a moment. Eventually, it was decided to try an innovative approach, to use DNA genealogy technology. But the help of the FBI was needed for this. Having tried all possible options, in August 2023, the local police department contacted the Federal Bureau of Investigation in Dallas with a request for assistance in the Terry McAdams case. It was planned to conduct a genetic study of DNA samples taken at the crime scene and from the victim's body in order to compile the offender's family tree. This made it possible to go beyond the Cody's database, which contained information only about individuals who had already committed offenses. DNA genealogy significantly increased the chances of finding all the killer's relatives, at least the closest ones. And already having this data, it was easier to calculate the identity of the criminal. This approach is considered much more effective because there are databases in which people voluntarily leave their DNA samples. At the time of the study, this database was so extensive that the probability of finding a match was close to 100%. And it really worked. FBI geneticists pointed to the Sharp family. It was an ordinary American family, but among its members, Bernard stood out. He was well known to the police back in the 80s of the last century. At the time of the crime, Bernard Sharp was 30 years old, and he was married. The most amazing thing was that the man was acquainted with Terry and her fiancé. Moreover, they were quite close neighbors. They communicated with Sharp even during the period when the investigation was being conducted into the girl's murder case. He actively cooperated with law enforcement officers and supported the relatives of the deceased. Bernard provided an alibi that seemed unconvincing to the police. However, during a subsequent check, his wife confirmed her husband's words, so an arrest was avoided. Eventually, all suspicions were removed from Sharp, and the unsuccessful investigation continued. However, the woman had to pay dearly for covering up for Bernard. Late in the evening of November 3, 1985, the police received a call from a man who introduced himself as the cousin of Sharp's wife. He reported that he had received a gunshot wound and needed help. As it turned out, there was an armed criminal in the house who attacked the cousin's wife, her friends, and the man himself. When law enforcement officers arrived at the scene of the tragedy, everything there resembled a bloody massacre. According to the wounded witness who called the police, late in the evening he returned home with his wife, her friend, and sister. The offender was already waiting for them in the dwelling, keeping his weapon at the ready. He opened fire, instantly taking the lives of 2 women and wounding the cousin. Despite the injury, the man managed to escape from the scene of the massacre and get to a neighbor. Fortunately, the wound turned out to be minor, and the cousin was convinced that he remained alive only because he was not the main target of the criminal. It seemed that Bernard did not expect that another man would be present in the house. And the armed intrusion was probably planned as another attack with the aim of. When the criminal realized that his plan had failed, he began to shoot indiscriminately, seeking to kill everyone who got in his way. In addition to the 2 women who died at the scene, the severely wounded brother of Bernard's deceased wife was found in the house, as well as Sharp himself with a gunshot wound to the head. It was impossible to detain and charge him. Bernard Sharp died on November 3, 1985, causing yet another bloody incident. Only now it became clear why after this tragedy, attacks on girls in the city stopped. The serial killer's wife's brother was lucky to survive, despite the injuries sustained. After a long period of recovery, he fully returned to normal life. However, he never managed to understand what exactly provoked the shooting. Before his death, Bernard did not leave any explanatory notes, so his decision to end his life was most likely spontaneous. During the investigation, it was not possible to find at least someone to whom Sharp would have told about his plans, as well as about his involvement in the murder of Terry and other girls. Although he did confess to several close friends that he knew who killed Terry, he never mentioned specific names. Whether it was a desperate attempt by the criminal to brag about his bloody exploits remained a mystery. A few months after Terry's murder, Bernard Sharp was found dead. Before that, he managed to kill his wife, her friend, and seriously injure his wife's brother. The police did not have a sample of Sharp's DNA at their disposal. The place of his burial, where the body could be exhumed for examination, could not be found. So law enforcement officers had to resort to extreme measures. To prove Bernard's involvement in the murder of Terry McAdams, officers were forced to travel outside the state to meet with one of his registered relatives. Despite the reluctance to have his name mentioned in connection with the crimes, the man still agreed to provide his own DNA sample. And it was thanks to forensic genealogy technology that Bernard Sharp's guilt was indisputably proven. At the time of his death, the police simply did not have the opportunity to compare the criminal's DNA with the samples taken at the scene of the crime. Law enforcement officers never managed to trace the connection between previous attacks. Probably, the reason was the change in Sharp's handwriting shortly before the murder of his own relatives. Previously, Bernard did not use firearms, preferring brutal beatings and violence. It is quite possible that due to the excessive workload during that period associated with the investigation of other crimes, the police simply could not establish a match in time. And since Sharp committed his fingerprints and other data did not end up in police databases. Therefore, there could be no matches in the Cody's system. Until his very death, Bernard lived not far from Terry McAdams' house. By the age of 30, he already had an extensive track record, which included numerous arrests for hooliganism, robbery, and assault. At least one case is known when Sharp, having lured 2 girls to his home by deception, brutally beat them, tied them up, and subjected them to using. The girls miraculously managed to survive after that attack and escape. They immediately turned to the police, after which Bernard Sharp was detained and charged. But thanks to the skill of his lawyer, the term of imprisonment turned out to be insignificant. Having barely been released, Sharp again became a person of interest in various criminal cases. And all this eventually led to the death of Terry McAdams. Given the nature of the offender's attacks, law enforcement officers assumed that he could be involved in other crimes committed in the same area. Finally, the perfect candidate for the role of a serial killer was found, who probably was behind a series of attacks on women that so frightened Terry during her lifetime. The DNA profile of the criminal's relative was transferred to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and also entered into the database of persons known in criminal circles. However, there is still no unequivocal confirmation of Sharp's involvement in other crimes. The investigation is still ongoing. For the family of the murdered girl, establishing the identity of the killer was a huge relief. Although they were never able to achieve justice and will not see how Terry's executioner ends up behind bars for the rest of his life or receives the highest measure of punishment, relatives still felt some satisfaction from the fact that the case was finally closed. The murder investigation, which lasted for 39 long years, has finally come to an end. And all this is thanks to innovative technologies. Terry McAdams' loved ones gave an interview to a local TV channel and told reporters about their feelings after the crime committed almost 4 decades ago was solved. Of course, they would have preferred to see with their own eyes how justice is restored and justice triumphs. And yet, consolation was brought by the thought that one of the most dangerous criminals himself ended his series of terrible deeds many years ago and could no longer harm anyone. If not for his death, over the next decade, Sharp's victims could have been many more innocent women. I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. Until next time, friends.